Good evening, dear ones, and welcome. My name is Joy Barrett. I serve as pastor of Chelsea First United Methodist Church. On behalf of the congregation, I extend a warm welcome to each of you, those of you in the room and those of you who are participating by live stream. Welcome. We are honored to host this event and honored that you have chosen to be part of this evening. I feel personally privileged to introduce our speaker, Dr. Christopher Seto. Chris and his family have a deep history with this congregation, where Chris was actively involved as he was growing up. I know Chris as exceptionally insightful, creative, one who is intelligent, curious, wise, and humble. Chris is intensely compassionate and committed to the greater good for every human being. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Purdue University. He has, yes, go Boilermakers. He has published research articles that explore patterns in human behavior and political and religious identities. Most recently, he has focused his work on the topic of Christian nationalism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Seto.
Well, thank you, Joy. Thank you so much, Joy. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm new to this sound system. My name is Chris Seto. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Friday evening. I know this is kind of a busy time of the year for many people, so I really appreciate everyone being here, in person or online. My name is Chris Seto. You may know me as John and Leanne's son, or Katie's brother. If you've been around the congregation a little while, you might remember me as that little kid about 20 years ago who wouldn't stop ripping up the bulletins during Sunday morning to do origami during church. So if that's you, let me just offer a very belated apology. I'm excited to be here talking about white Christian nationalism, which is a primary research interest of mine over the past several years. And I understand that this overlaps with some ongoing work and learning that the congregation here has been doing. So I'm thrilled that our interests have kind of aligned in this way, and I'm excited to be here. Like Joy said, I am currently an assistant professor of sociology at Purdue, and this is, I'm excited to be talking. We can probably jump to the next slide here. All right, so I start all my classes like this. I always like to do a bit of an outline so that people know kind of what to expect. So very briefly, what are we here to do tonight? First, let's do, yes, one more. Perfect. I want to talk about white Christian nationalism, specifically what it is, right? I think a lot of us have probably heard this phrase in sort of our daily lives, right? You may have heard it in a book group if you've been participating in the one that the congregation did this past summer, maybe on the news, maybe in a conversation, maybe on Facebook. There's been a lot of discourse around this in the last several years, and while I think that's very important, a challenge that's come with that, I think, has been a sort of conceptual muddying of this term. So I think there's some sort of confusion in the discourse around what this phrase actually means. So I'd like to start by talking about what Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism actually is, and importantly, what it is not. So we'll sort of focus on that. Next, I want to make a few points about sort of why the general public should care about this, right? I'm a sociologist. I focus on religion, so I have some sort of professional reasons to care, right, about Christian nationalism. But if you are not a sociologist professionally, I want to sort of make the argument that you too should care about white Christian nationalism. So we will sort of go in that direction next. Third, I'll be sort of just running through just a few sort of key takeaways from what we talk about tonight. And then fourth, I think we're going to wrap up with a sort of discussion and Q&A period. So that's the plan. Before we jump into that, though, I want to just real briefly note a couple things that I'm really not planning on doing tonight, really not here to do. The first one is I'm not here to argue whether the US is or has ever been a Christian nation. This, I think, is a question for historians, right? I am not a historian. Historians have written a great deal about this, and I'm happy to, during the Q&A, if you're interested, we can get into that. But that's not really my focus. I am a sociologist, so and because I focus on things like religion and belief systems, my work deals with the effects of those things in society. So I'm not really in the business of looking at the content of those belief systems and trying to judge, to what extent is this true or not true. I'm interested in what is the fact that people believe these things. What are the effects of that on their behaviors, their attitudes? What are the effects on society? So that'll be kind of the focus tonight. Second, I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I understand that this topic, right, Christian nationalism, again, it's received a lot of focus in the news media, and it's got some very clear connections to our current political landscape. But I'm not here to try to persuade you to do anything, right, or take a certain kind of political action going forward. My goal here is to present information. So it's quite possible that at the end of our time tonight, after I've sort of outlined, white Christian nationalism, what do sociologists mean by this term? What is the vision of this cultural framework for U.S. society? You might think to yourself, right? You might walk out of here and think, I agree with that, right? That is also my vision for U.S. society. If that's the case, it's quite likely that you and I will vote in different ways, and that's okay, right? That's part of being in a democracy. So I'm not here to try to bring you over to my way of thinking about anything in particular. I'm just here to offer some information, and what you choose to do with that information is entirely up to you. So having sort of offered those brief disclaimers, let's jump ahead. So a quick sort of just overview of my primary sources. Several of you, I think, have read Jim Wallace's book, which is a great, does a great job covering this topic. I'll be drawing on sort of three primary sources from the sort of sociological literature on this topic. So the first is Taking America Back for God. This was written by two sociologists, Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, and published in 2016. Next is The Flag and the Cross, which is kind of a follow-up to this, published in 2022. That does a bit of, kind of a bit more of like a historical take on this. And then most recently, Andrew Whitehead published a book called American Idolatry, which I think is probably of these the most similar to Jim Wallace's book because it's speaking directly to Christians. And so this is kind of just, I wanted to start with this so that if you're interested and you want to do more reading on this topic, I'm happy to, during the Q&A, if you want to ask about certain aspects of this, I can recommend one of these books or a different book, but this is kind of where I'm drawing a lot of what I'll be speaking about tonight. All right, so to start then, part one, what is white Christian nationalism? I'm going to start by doing something I tell whenever I'm teaching my students how to start presentations. I always say, don't throw a lot of text on the slide, and I'm going to break my rule and do that. But I think it's a very good reason. I'm going to start with a quote. So this is from American Idolatry. Andrew Whitehead, I think, does a great job summing this up. White Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, and I've bolded that. So just put a pin in that phrase. We'll circle back to what that means. A cultural framework that idealizes and advocates for a fusion of a particular expression of Christianity, and again, particular expression, keep that in the back of your head, particular expression of Christianity with American civic life. It holds that this version of Christianity should be the principal and undisputed cultural framework in the US, and that the government should vigorously preserve that cultural framework. So that was a lot, right? That was a lot of words to just toss at you to start. So let's unpack this a little bit. What do I mean by a cultural framework? This is a term that sociologists draw on a lot. And again, there are sort of a few different ways to understand this. But first and foremost, a cultural framework is just something that orients you to the world, right? So this is from Taking America Back for God. It's a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems. So sort of a collection of these kind of cultural artifacts that orient you to the world. Another way to think about this is a story, right? The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. The term deep story is used a lot in the literature to sort of reference this idea as well. A deep story is a story, a cultural framework that's so ingrained that we don't even necessarily think about it. It's just kind of there, sort of coloring our worldview and affecting how we interpret the world. Yes, so a deep story. Okay, so a natural question then, right, is if Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism is this cultural framework, and a cultural framework consists of a deep story, what is the deep story of white Christian nationalism? So this is, again, from the Flag and the Cross, but I'm going to kind of bullet point through sort of what we're talking about here. So what is this deep story? First, that America was founded as a nation by Christian, implicitly white men. Next, these men were traditional Christians who based the nation's founding documents on Christian principles. Third, the US has been blessed by God, so this is kind of a emphasis on sort of US exceptionalism, right? And this is why the US as a nation has been so successful. Fourth, because of this sort of special blessing by God, right, the US has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity. Fifth, these blessings, right, again, this is a story, right, this is a deep story, and stories have to have conflict. So an important part of this story of white Christian nationalism is that there are bad guys, right? So the US has this special plan, right, this divinely sanctioned plan, but there are threats to this, right? This plan is threatened by cultural degradation from others, right? From un-American influences, both inside and outside our borders. And then finally, all of this, right, focuses on sort of where we've been as a nation and where we are as a nation. But Christian nationalism is also very much about sort of an idealized vision for America. So drawing on all of this kind of past and present, Christian nationalism advocates for this fusion, right, of Christianity and the U.S. national identity in such a way that the U.S. is a nation sort of for Christians and ruled by Christians. So again, that was sort of a lot to just throw at you, but deep stories are not just about ideas, right? They're also about symbols and tangible physical artifacts, right? So I want to just kind of briefly highlight a few aspects of this Christian nationalism deep story that you may have come across in your everyday life. So, right, so one is historical artwork that depicts founding fathers kind of having these like moments of divine revelation, right? So we have George Washington praying. This is a fairly famous picture. We also have sort of this like content that's specifically focused on this kind of this deep story, right? So if you Google like America's Christian heritage, right, you can find all sorts of DVDs and books. I think this one is a DVD, but it's built or it's centered on this idea that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation, and in some way we need to sort of reclaim that. You'll also, I think I Googled on Amazon or Walmart, right, America's Christian heritage, and you can find a lot of these sort of physical cultural artifacts that represent this idea as well, right? So we have, I think that's a yard sign, I think, Jesus hugging the flag. We also have a sign you can put on your house that says this home is protected by Jesus and a gun, and there's American flags. The t-shirt, I don't know if you can read that, it says Make America Godly Again, and there's a cross and a flag, which I think is kind of an important, a bit of an important kind of addition beyond these other things, because implicit in that statement, right, is the idea that America was at one time godly and is no more, and we need to sort of reclaim that, right? We need to take America back for God. There's also, and again, if you watch the news, I'm sure you've seen these ideas come up. The idea of America's Christian heritage, right, being talked about by a White House spokesperson, controversy over a billboard that had, America is a Christian nation printed sort of front and center there. So we've all come across aspects and elements of this cultural framework, right, this deep story. I want to return to the definition and just dig a little bit more into what we're talking about here. Because if you remember, the definition doesn't just say a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. It's a particular expression of Christianity. Yes, this version of Christianity. So a natural follow-up question then, right, is what does that mean? What is the particular expression of Christianity that we're talking about? We're not talking about Christianity in some sort of global, inclusive sense. We're talking about a very sort of specific kind. And the important point, I think, to grasp here is that the Christianity of white Christian nationalism represents something more than religion. This is a quote from Taking America Back for God. But there's all of this other stuff included in the idea of Christianity as it's used in the deep story of Christian nationalism. Specifically, and I'll just read this quote, Christian nationalism, includes assumptions of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, along with divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. Importantly, it is as ethnic and political as it is religious. So that is kind of the core takeaway of this, right, is when we talk about Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, we're not just talking about this version of America that is focused on Christianity. We're talking about a version of America that is idealizing all of these other things as well. And I think a very natural, reasonable thing to ask, right, after I've just made this claim, or more accurately, right, I've quoted a claim by other sociologists. We can have the next slide now. Yeah, is how do we know this, right? I've just told you that this deep story of Christian nationalism is not just about Christianity, it's actually about all of this other stuff, right? And a very reasonable question might be, how do we know, right? Or prove it. In other words, right, you might very reasonably say, wait a minute, Chris, hold on. You're a politically progressive academic, right? You probably have a very different cultural framework or a very different deep story than someone who might be endorsing or advocating for Christian nationalism. So maybe you're just using words like white supremacy and authoritarian control as a way to sort of vilify people that have views about religion and country that are different than your own, right? That would be a very reasonable thing to ask, and this is something that comes up, right, in conversations like this, where people will say, oh, maybe this is just a way to sort of name call, right? Is Christian nationalist just kind of a slur? And so the question then becomes, how do we test, right, how do we explore whether the Christianity of this deep story of Christian nationalism, how do we test whether that conception of Christianity is really about things that are more than religion, right? Things that perhaps go into the ethno-racial realm or the political realm. I think there's a few ways to do this, but I am a quantitative social scientist, which is a fancy way of saying a data nerd, and I would like to explore this question quantitatively. So I promise we're not going to get too deep in the statistical weeds here, but I think it's helpful to sort of just outline a few points for like how sociologists might go about sort of exploring this question, right? So first, we would need to identify a population of interest. In the context of this research question, right, looking at Christian nationalism and sort of what this belief system encompasses, we would probably want to explore the views of the population of the US. Sometimes in these studies, the sort of population of interest will be restricted to like white Americans, especially if we're looking at different sort of views on race or views on inclusion and nativism. So sometimes that's the population, but it depends. Sometimes it's sort of it depends on the study. So we can talk a bit more during the Q&A about sort of how those choices get made. But in general, right, you would find a population of interest, and you would take a sample, right? We can't survey everyone in the United States. That would be prohibitively time-consuming and expensive. But we can take a small sample and survey them, and if we do the sampling correctly, statistics allows us to generalize to a broader population. So that would be the first step of testing this. Next, we would need to find a plausible way to measure this deep story of Christian nationalism. And sociologists do this in a number of different ways, but I think the sort of go-to approach is to administer a survey, right? So you would field a survey to your population of interest, your sample, and you would find ways to ask about sort of belief and endorsement of this deep story. So for example, researchers often use survey prompts such as indicate your level of agreement with the following. And then they'll say things like, the federal government should declare the US a Christian nation. The federal government should advocate Christian values. The success of the US is part of God's plan. Or being Christian is important to being truly American. So all of these things, you'll notice, right, tap into that deep story. And none of them are explicitly about any of that other stuff I was talking about, right? Race, nativism, patriot, none of that is included in those questions. So you ask about this deep story. Sometimes you would use one of these. Oftentimes you would ask multiple, and you'd sort of combine those questions into some sort of score, and then that would indicate sort of level of agreement with this deep story of Christian nationalism. And then the third step would be, one more. There we go. You'd have to ask those same people, right, that same sample, something to measure the outcome. So for example, if you were interested in how this story of white Christian nationalism influences attitudes about race, you'd have to ask about racial attitudes. There's been a lot of different studies on this, and I can talk more about sort of the other things that I included in that, something more than religion. For now, we're going to focus on white supremacy, racial attitudes, and nativism. And then fourth, and this is sort of where the statistics comes in, you would use a technique called multiple regression, which would allow you to examine a correlation between this deep story of Christian nationalism that you measured in step 2 and the outcome that you measured in step 3. And importantly, statistical regression lets you control or adjust for other possible influences. So for example, in the models that we're going to talk about tonight, in general, you would control for things like political party, right? Race, gender, age, income, like all of these other possible things that might influence your outcome. You would sort of net those away statistically in order to examine a correlation between this deep story of Christian nationalism and some outcome that you're interested in. So the question then, right, what have researchers found in doing all of that? There's a lot of studies out there, so I've kind of compiled a few here, done a bit of a lit review for you. But Christian nationalism, right, measured in the way that I described, is a strong predictor of a lot of things, such as opposition to interracial marriage, opposition to interracial adoption, and both of these tap sort of notions of racial purity. Next, a belief in the inherent violence and criminality of Black Americans and immigrants, anti-immigrant stereotyping, dehumanization and prejudice, animosity towards Muslims and Muslim Americans, agreement that racial diversity hinders national unity, racist and xenophobic narratives about the COVID-19 pandemic, and then finally, and this one doesn't have a citation because it's some of my own work that's under review and in progress, but it's also a very strong predictor of sort of an implicit, what I'm calling Asian foreigner bias, or like an implicit perception of Asian Americans as sort of foreign or other, as well as sort of like racial scapegoating for the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is measured using sort of directly survey questions and language. So a lot of racial attitudes, right, are strongly predicted by this measure that on its face, right, doesn't appear to be about race, right? It's asking about Christianity and sort of the role that Christianity should have in the nation of the United States. So to summarize, right, and again, this is a quote. I feel like I'm throwing a lot of quotes at you, but they're all really good. To summarize, Americans who embrace Christian nationalism, particularly if they're white, remain committed to the belief that real Americans, or at least the good kind of Americans, are native-born white Christians. So that is kind of a summary of the extant literature on this topic. Next slide. I want to make a couple important notes before we move on to sort of like why the general public should care about this topic. The first one is that this deep story of Christian nationalism, it didn't just come out of nowhere. So there's a clear like historical trajectory to this that stretches all the way back before the US was even founded. And as I've already noted, I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to spend too much time walking you through this. There are great books on this topic. The Flag and the Cross, I would recommend. But just very briefly, this notion, right, of the deep story of Christian nationalism and how it's sort of implicitly racialized, this goes all the way back to sort of the earliest colonists and the earliest settlers who would think of sort of Christianity, right, as implicitly white. So if you are Christian, you're white and you're civilized, and that would be contrasted to non-Christian, heathen, not white, savagery, right? And we can, yeah, I think that's the next, yes. And then the next piece of this, right, so manifest destiny and westward expansion, this subjugation of non-white people as sort of like a divine mandate in the US. And then they trace this, right, these historical accounts trace this, this narrative all the way up to sort of the rise of the religious right, following the civil rights movement, and even to sort of our current political moment. So you can see this sort of like through line as you look at American history. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, right? Like this thing that we're talking about, white Christian nationalism, did not just like appear, right, like a few years ago. This is a very old thing that sort of morphs and adapts to whatever the current cultural moment is. Another important note is that white Christian nationalism in the US is a unique cultural framework, right? It's not reducible to or synonymous with a number of things that I think it is often incorrectly conflated with. So it's not synonymous with being Christian in the US, right? There are Christians in the US who would unequivocally reject the cultural framework of white Christian nationalism, and there are folks in the US who would, by most conventional measures, probably not be considered Christian, but who are very strong advocates for it, right? So this is not reducible to only religious terms, because it is a deep story that includes things that go beyond religion. So it's not just being Christian in the US, it's not being a politically conservative Christian in the US, right? You can be a politically conservative Christian who rejects Christian nationalism. It's not being a white evangelical Protestant in the US. It's not even being a politically active conservative Christian or evangelical Protestant in the US. And I think that this is the one that often is where some of this confusion happens, right? So people hear someone maybe arguing against Christian nationalism or saying Christian nationalism is a threat to US democracy, and they hear that as, oh, well, that means, you know, you're arguing that Christians in the US should not be politically active. And in general, if it's a sociologist arguing, that's not what they're saying at all, right? But I think that conflation can happen and it can lead to some confusion. I would also say that I think sometimes people make that conflation in sort of a bad faith kind of setting up a straw man argument. So I think that happens too. But in many cases, I think it's genuine confusion around what this actually means. So I want to just sort of highlight that Christian nationalism is its own thing, and it's not the same as any of those other things that I listed. Okay, so that's what white Christian nationalism is. Why does it matter, right? Why should you, maybe some of you are sociologists of religion, but I'm guessing many of you are not. Why should you care about this? I think there are a lot of reasons, but the first one, right, is that this is not some fringe sort of thing that is just sort of on the edges of mainstream society, these ideas are fairly popular. So it's difficult to gauge like precisely, right? Because this is a deep sort of cultural narrative that's got a lot of facets and it's complicated. It's difficult to gauge like precisely to what extent the American public has sort of like accepted this. But roughly, right, the estimate is kind of like close to half of Americans, right? So this is from Whitehead's book, and this squares with recent data from the Pew Research Center. So again, the way you would approach this, right, is you would take a sample, a representative sample of the U.S. public, and you would ask them things about this deep story. So, for example, the statistic here, more than 4 in 10, I think it's 45% of U.S. adults say that the country should be a Christian nation. So that alone, I think, suggests, even beyond all of the sort of like cultural artifacts that I showed earlier and that I imagine many of you have seen in your everyday lives, this suggests that this is a pretty widespread belief system, right? So I think that alone is a good reason for all of us as people that live in the United States to care about this, right? This is a fairly mainstream position. Secondly, another reason that I think you should care about this is that white Christian nationalism is politically powerful. So there's a few ways that this can sort of work, right? But I think one of the most important is that this cultural framework of Christian nationalism has allowed the term Christian to mean a lot of things in contemporary political discourse. So in the sociology and sort of political science literature, we might refer to this as a political dog whistle, right? A term that means different things depending on the context and can kind of stand in for some things. So because there's all these assumptions about sort of race and ethnicity and birth status and belonging wrapped up in the idea of Christianity, in this narrative of Christian nationalism, this allows political actors and people using political speech to use the term Christian as kind of a stand-in for other things in ways that might be politically advantageous. So, for example, a recent study found, and this is a really interesting approach because it used like experimental methods. So they were doing this like in a psychology lab. Found that when you would prime subjects, and they did this on a sample of like white Christians in the US, when you prime subjects with stories of Christian persecution, it would actually like increase their sort of racial animosity and their perceptions of white persecution. So there's clearly this sort of psychological overlap in people's minds, and political actors can use that to their advantage, right, in the form of this political dog whistle. The second way is that political actors will leverage this deep story of Christian nationalism. You recall that an important part of this story, right, is that there's a threat, right? There's good guys and there's bad guys. And in politics, right, anytime you can talk about a grievance or talk about a threat, that's often very resonant. So people will rely on this deep story as a way to sort of mobilize a base, perhaps, talking in terms of like religious struggle, right? So this is a quote from Donald Trump that was earlier this year. They, right, want to tear down crosses where they can and cover them up with social justice flags. But no one will be touching the cross of Christ under the Trump administration, I swear to you. I think he was speaking to I think it was like an organization of Christian broadcasters. But you can see in that quote, right, there's this sort of struggle, right, being described. And sort of related to the first point on this slide, it's worth asking, right, is Trump in this quote talking just about Christianity in sort of a theological sense, right? Or are there sort of other things wrapped up in this idea of Christian, right? Like what's a social justice flag, right? Like that's a bit unclear. But it seems important, I think, to interrogate statements like that. So the takeaway from this slide, I think, is that especially in our current political context, right? We're in the middle of an election year. I would encourage everyone, especially if you identify as Christian, to pay close attention to how the term Christian is used by political actors. And if somebody says something is Christian, right, whether it's a policy or a candidate or anything, right, if someone refers to Christianity or Christians, I encourage you to ask yourself, is this person, right, is this thing that's being described, does it reflect the values of my faith, right? Is it Christ-like in some way, or is the term Christian in this context being used as code, right, as a dog whistle for something else? I think the extent to which that's true will vary based on the situation, of course, but I think that's an important thing to be aware of, that this happens in contemporary political discourse, so I would encourage everyone to sort of be mindful of that as you're consuming political content. And then third, and I think this is related to those other points, white Christian nationalism is inherently anti-democratic. The way that it's used and the way that it's enacted in US society tends to clash with what we would think of as sort of like peaceful, functioning democracy. And the way this works is kind of not surprising if you think about the implications of that deep story, right? The idea that in the cultural framework of white Christian nationalism, political outcomes and processes are like framed as spiritual warfare, right? So a political a political candidate is not just a politician or a political candidate. They're like an agent of either God or Satan, right? Like the stakes are framed as being very high. An election is not just a mechanism of the democratic process. It's like a battle, right, for the soul of our nation. So I think because of that, right, there's a tendency for those who endorse and accept this deep story of Christian nationalism, there's a tendency to deprioritize the democratic process in favor of achieving one's political goals, because there's this sort of heightening of the stakes, if you will, when everything is termed and framed in spiritual warfare. So these are images from, I think, the sort of most clear example of this in recent years. This was the riot at the Capitol on January 6th of 2021. And many people were watching this, and I think were very sort of surprised to see a lot of overt Christian imagery, right, at that event. So we have Jesus in a MAGA hat. We have the cross being erected, right, and people carrying signs that say "Jesus saved" or "Jesus saves" as they marched on the Capitol. And on its face, right, that's sort of maybe confusing, and it's not clear what religion, right, or what Christianity has to do with that event. But I think the lens and this framework of white Christian nationalism can very much help us understand events like this, right? This event is framed in terms of spiritual warfare. That is, you might say, kind of an extreme example, but this kind of anti-democratic tendency of Christian nationalism has also been borne out in population-level research. So studies that have approached this basically using the same methodology that I outlined earlier have found a number of sort of important connections between acceptance of this deep story of Christian nationalism and things like support for the Capitol riot and political violence more generally, supporting efforts to restrict voting and make voting harder, and also, and I think this one is kind of important, a tendency to buy into sort of like deep state, sort of conspiracy narratives. So I have some work that looks at this question. But if you accept this narrative, it fosters a lot of, I think, distrust in the government and in people sort of outside of your tribe. And I think that is sort of inherently damaging to the fabric of our society and to a functioning democracy. So all of that to say that there's empirical reasons to sort of draw this connection between Christian nationalism and sort of a tendency toward authoritarianism and away from democracy. So just to sum up then, and this is, I don't know if you're familiar with the acronym TLDR, which stands for Too Long Didn't Read, but this is kind of my too long didn't read slide. So if you're gonna just take away one slide from this, this would be the one. So first, white Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that advocates and idealizes a fusion of a particular kind of Christianity with American civic life. That's just that quote from earlier. Importantly in that, right, this particular kind of Christianity is not just about religion. It's not just about a particular sort of theological orientation to the world. It's also about a lot of other things, including race, ethnicity, native birth status, and all sorts of other things. White Christian nationalism is not equivalent to Christians being politically active. I think that is, if you're going to take like one thing away from this, maybe make it be that. I think this is a really important distinction to make. And related to that, right, if you're going to be listening to political speech, just be mindful of how the term Christian is used. Finally, Christian nationalism is widespread, politically resonant, and I would argue inherently anti-democratic. So before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to wrap up, if I could, on just kind of a personal note. So as I said, I've been thinking about white Christian nationalism quite a bit in the last few years in kind of a professional or academic capacity. But I've been thinking about it like extra much, I think, in the last 8 months or so. And the reason for that is because, as some of you may know, my wife and I, Elena, are expecting our first baby in like 3 weeks. It's very soon. But, oh, thank you. So I think part of thinking about, right, becoming a parent very soon is thinking a lot about the kind of society that I want my child to grow up in and sort of one day inherit. And in thinking about that, right, and sort of imagining what that society would look like, some of the most important kind of attributes of that society, for me, all right, are multiculturalism and democracy. Now, like I said, this is a personal anecdote, so we are straying into kind of like my personal preferences for what society should look like. But I would argue that I think these are things, right, multiculturalism and democracy, I think these are things that a lot of people, a lot of Americans value about our society, a lot of Christians, I would imagine. And as a sociologist, I see Christian nationalism as the sort of one of the most substantial threats to these aspects about our society that I value that's like around today. So it's my hope that by sort of naming the problem, right, by having conversations like the one we're having tonight, we as a society can be sort of better informed about this and therefore sort of better able to respond to what I see as the threat of white Christian nationalism. That's all I have, so I will wrap up there. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Okay, well, we have about 40 minutes or so of time for question and answer. I'm going to be moderating that, and starting us off, we can sit if you want, Chris, or we can stand, or whatever you want to do. But I'm gonna
I like
sit.
these chairs.
Oh boy, yeah, if we don't fall over. So I'm gonna start off with a question for Chris, and then that'll give you maybe some time to formulate additional thoughts and questions. We have a live stream going on, so we have maybe people online if they are interested in posing questions too. We have a way to bring those questions forward. And we have a couple folks with microphones who will be moving around the space in order to answer those questions. So to start off, thank you very much. I'm confident you're going to be a great dad, Chris, because you were a great babysitter to my kids back in the day in this congregation. Yeah, so this is really special to have Chris back and to be able to have this conversation with you now. So my name's Ron Murad, by the way. I'm a member of this church, and as I said, I knew Chris when he was a teenager, at least, right? So I think, if I understood it right, what I heard you setting up was it's not obvious that Christian nationalism would be correlated with whiteness or white supremacy. And so you provided these statistical studies to show that, yeah, there is a correlation, right? It's correlated to all sorts of characteristics associated with white supremacy. And it is odd on its face, right? Because especially in our pluralistic, kind of, in a way, post-Christian culture, you might say, most people would know, have Black American friends who are Christian, or Latinx American friends who are Christian, right? It's sort of odd, and yet the correlation is there. So the big question is why? Why are the two correlated? And you gestured at some historical parallels and explanations. Have people studied this sociologically to try to get at the why of the correlation between Christian nationalism with qualitative studies or in other ways? So I'd just be curious to hear you speak to that while people are thinking about additional questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I think getting at the why is always tricky, right? Because you can show a statistical correlation and you can show these things are related, right? This idea of what it means to be Christian is, based on the data, right, very clearly embeds things like race and nativism. I think the why is tricky, right? So I would say there's definitely these historical threads, but in terms of sort of understanding the contemporary, right, the sociological aspects of this, I think the big thing goes back to this idea of threat, right? So implicit in this deep story of white Christian nationalism is this idea of like an us and a them, right? And I think people buy into that. And if you sort of see the world in those terms, who the us is and who the them is, that might vary based on the context. So you might have friends, right, that maybe are of a different race, and that might sort of to you seem like, oh, well, they're okay, right? They're in my group. Mm-hmm. But I think implicit in this deep story is this sort of generalized other, right? So whether that's someone in a different political party, or an undocumented person, or someone of a different race that I don't know, right? Maybe someone of a different race that I see in a context that makes me feel fearful. All of that is sort of built into that story. So I think it goes back to that idea of threat and in some ways grievance. And so the idea that you in your everyday life, right, might encounter people of different backgrounds, and maybe you're not like openly hostile to them. I don't think that those things necessarily conflict, right? Because of how this framework kind of operates in the background. Does that help?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, it does. So that's great. I have other follow-up questions I can ask, but I do not want to take your time to ask questions. So let me open it up. And there's a question right there. Thank you.
My question is, are white Christian nationalists in all churches throughout Christianity, say when I'm talking about the United States? In other words, is there a church called White Christian Nationalist, or are these people interspersed throughout the country in different faiths?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for bringing that up. So there is not like I said, this is not reducible to a church, right, or a religious movement. So I would say there are people, right, and I think this is very much not a binary thing, right? So I presented some data that was like, 45% of people agree with the statement that America should be a Christian nation. I think that's a little bit misleading because it presents this as like a binary, like you are a Christian nationalist or you're not. And it's very much, this is a spectrum, right? So in their original book, Whitehead and Perry have this sort of like distribution, and you can see like, on the one end they sort of argue these people are like the ambassadors for Christian nationalism. So these are the people that are really advocating and really sort of working to advance this story. And then you have people that are like on the other end, the resistors, right? And these are the people that are like unequivocally like, no, that's bad, that's really a problem. But like a lot of people are kind of in the middle, right? So it is sort of a distribution. And yeah, there's not like a single church that's like, we are the Christian nationalists. You do have nowadays, I think, people leaning into this term, right? So like people that will sort of claim this and say like, I identify as a Christian nationalist, and sometimes they write books, and that's like very interesting reading. But this is not a reducible to like one particular church. I would say it is more prevalent in some churches, right? So there is, like, again, looking at sort of statistically, this is sort of this deep story is, I would say, most prevalent in like sort of like fundamentalist or like white evangelical Protestant spaces, but it is absolutely, I think, present across the sort of denominational spectrum, and like I said, even outside of churches. So this is not a thing that only Christians do. You have, I think, plenty of people that would score very high on these Christian nationalism scales, but again, for them, Christianity is more of a cultural or like a racial or political marker than it is a religious marker. So they may never go to church. They may not sort of subscribe to, what we might think of as conventionally Christian beliefs or behaviors, but they would score very high on Christian nationalism. So this is sort of separate from what we would think of as conventional religion.
Great
question.
Quick follow-up to that. So if you are somewhere in the middle of that spectrum you described, I feel like I've heard people say, they probably wouldn't agree with all the elements of the deep story that you presented of Christian nationalism, but they would say something like, well, I'm not a Christian nationalist, but I do think that America will flourish if we integrate more Christian values. Or they'll say something like, knowledge of and understanding of and celebration of, even to take the white part of it, right? European culture is foundational to the flourishing of American democracy, or some version of that. Do you see correlations weakening between the whiteness and the allegiance to that deep story? So people in the middle of the spectrum, are they less likely to agree with statements correlated with white supremacy? Yeah.
So part of, and I wish I should have put some graphs in here, right? I think that would have been helpful. So part of this identifying a correlation, right, is the idea that if you score, right, so like if you were to agree with some of the statements, perhaps, but not all. So maybe you're in the middle. You're comfortable with this idea. You're not necessarily like, no, that seems problematic, but you're like, oh, that, some of that seems right, maybe not. Maybe I don't want the government to advocate Christian values all the time, maybe just a little bit, or some Christian values. So yes, you would be estimated, right? And again, this is in a sort of statistical sense. So it's not really able to, like, I wouldn't be able to make accurate predictions about an individual person. This is sort of in the population, right? But yes, you would be estimated to probably be less likely, say, to oppose interracial marriage than somebody who's very high on the scale, and you would be more likely to oppose interracial marriage, for example, than someone very low on the scale.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Others? Yes.
Is there any data about regional variation?
We can hear you. Just hold it close.
So is there any data about regional variation in Christian nationalism in the United States?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. There is. Yeah, it's a little difficult to say with certainty because of how these surveys are often, right, like say 1,000 people out of the 300,000 some that live in the US. So when you try to aggregate to specific regions, you can run into problems with sort of your sample size not being big enough, and you might be trying to estimate a sort of a level of Christian nationalism based on, like, for example, like 20 people that live in a specific city or something. But yeah, there's, again, if you look at Take America Back for God, they have a really helpful map that's broken, I think it's broken out by like census region. So it tends to be highest, at least when they look at the data, I think their data are from 2014, they published it in 2016. At that time, looking at the data, their measure tended to be highest in sort of the South, and I think it was lowest kind of on like the sort of the West Coast. But again, it was like a very rough, like sort of 4 regions of the U.S. And it was kind of more of a, just to give people kind of a descriptive sense of how this is distributed. So there are data, but it's not perfect.
Yes. Heidi first, and then the woman in the row in front of Heidi.
I just wondered if there's anything in the data that sort of indicates where the White Christian Nationalist movement if you will be in the future, like 5 years out, 20 years out, 50 years out?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So there are, like I said, this is pretty widespread, right? So there's relatively high sort of acceptance and I would say endorsement of this idea. But there is some evidence to suggest, and again, all of this is sort of, you're trying to estimate based on, sort of samples that are drawn, across years. There's some evidence to suggest that this, the actual sort of number of people that buy, that accept this deep story might be declining slightly in recent years. But I think it's difficult to say sort of where this story will end up because so much of it is contingent on the cultural moment, right? So I think a lot of the extent to which this is prevalent or sort of normative or not normative will depend on kind of where we as a country push it, right? So I think a lot of this will depend on sort of the books that you're allowed to read in school, right? And the kinds of conversations that people have in spaces like this. So I would say demographically, there's some evidence to suggest that the sort of popularity of this is declining slightly. But I think politically, right, the sort of power of this has grown a lot recently. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I would say there are some indications that there are some data to look at this over time. But what those data actually mean, I think, is difficult to say with any degree of certainty.
Well, so again, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up to
Yeah.
that. So there have been a couple of recent Supreme Court decisions that are sort of weakening some traditional jurisprudence regarding the First Amendment, disestablishment of religion clause. Do sociologists ever look at the public reactions to those things? Is there, say, a backlash when a baker is allowed to deny a couple their wedding cake based on their religious identity, for instance? Does that tend to get people saying, oh, well, that crosses a line, I don't like that, and so maybe we don't want so many Christian values in the public sphere, or does it, do we not see those kinds of fluctuations, and maybe that's too micro to register?
Yeah, so that's a really good question as well. I think that when there are sort of current events like that, right? You can, I mean, if you were tracking this, sort of day by day in some way, I think you probably would register, and I don't think it would necessarily be sort of a uniform, bump one way or the other. I think it's likely something like that might, for some groups, maybe groups that are already sort of opposed to this version or this vision of American society, for them it might sort of, maybe push them a little more towards the sort of resist end of the spectrum, right? Oh, that's problematic, and you might have people that are sort of on the acceptance side thinking no, that's great, right? That is the kind of sort of religious freedom I want, right? I want to be able to exert my religious freedom in those ways. I sort of side note, the term religious freedom is very focused on right now in sociology because it can mean so many things, right? And I think to the cultural framework of Christian nationalism, religious freedom, I think is in the same way that Christian has kind of become a bit of a dog whistle. I think the term religious freedom has also been co-opted in some ways. But
Thank you.
yeah.
You have a few more. So there was someone in the row in front of Heidi who was going to ask a question. I don't know if she still wants to, but it was... Okay, good. It's your turn.
Well, I guess I should say I'm very not knowledgeable about white Christian nationalism. So this was my first basic introduction to the concept and the thought process. But I guess it says a threat to faith and democracy. So as you presented this from a sociological standpoint, where do people in general in our culture and our society move forward to, you said it's now the larger portion of our society who is of this thinking or concept. What are some suggestions for how do we address that to curb that, proliferation of that concept in that direction?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I wish I had a. like a-
I mean, there has to be some strategies, right? I mean, when we think, I mean, you've done a lot more research with it than any of us have. I'm thinking, this is monumental, really, when you look at it in relationship to our democracy. And I guess I'm sort of looking at it from a personal perspective, because I do have a dear friend who I would say would be of that alignment, but doesn't really categorize it as white Christian
yeah.
nationalism.
So just because I don't think you had the mic at the end there, I'm going to repeat it for the live stream. You have a friend who may say some things that sound like they're of this perspective, and you're really looking for concrete, pragmatic suggestions, given that if one is persuaded that this is dangerous for our democracy or anti-democratic or somehow fundamentally incompatible with their values, how does one approach conversations with someone who's attracted to this collection of viewpoints, and what pragmatic suggestions do you have?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important question. And often that is, I think, a shortcoming of studies like those that I presented is sociologists love to point out problems, and sometimes when it comes to the end of the paper, we say, well, that's the problem, so that's enough for it. But I think, so if I were to make some suggestions, right, I think a big problem with this story, and really any sort of deep story, right, and cultural framework, and something that I'm kind of, by talking about it, right, I think I'm trying to kind of address this. Often it's very implicit, right, and it's not like someone is consciously thinking like, yes, this is where we're as a country, and this is how I want our country to progress in steps A, B, and C. Like, it's sort of something that operates in the background, and can sort of affects how someone experiences the world in ways that they might not even realize, right? So it could be that someone who is feeling like this deep story is resonating with them, they might be especially susceptible to, like, if a politician is going to talk about Christian values being under attack, and like that, because that is so resonant with their sort of with their deep story, right? Like that's probably going to strike a chord with them, and that could sort of pull them a little more into that perspective. So I think a really important thing would be to bring it up, right? So like have those conversations. And my hope, right, with that sort of bullet pointed slide is like to give you some talking points, maybe, right? If you end up having conversations like that with your friends and family, if you feel like that's something you want to do. I think naming it is important, and sort of like asking follow-up questions, right? So like if somebody says something like, oh, I'm going to, I support such and such, or I'm going to do so and so because of the threat to Christians, or because I'm a Christian and I love this country, or something along those lines. I think it's worth asking follow-up questions. Like, don't dismiss it out of hand, right? Like, say like, oh, can you explain that more, right? Like, what about this thing is feeling like it resonates with aspects of your Christian faith, right? And see if you can kind of get them to explain it a little bit and sort of think through it. I think that's a helpful way to approach that, right? Because from my perspective, many aspects of this deep story about Christian nationalism are very opposed to sort of what I think of as the values of Christianity, right? Like, much of this is sort of focused on accumulating political power, which I think in some ways is, and I'm not a pastor, so I don't want to sort of get outside my lane here, but that seems to me to be sort of antithetical to the gospel. So I think having those conversations and sort of trying to point out, like, wow, that seems like maybe you're talking about something other than Christianity now, or maybe when you use the word Christian, it sounds like maybe you're talking about a racial group rather than a religious idea. I think that would be a good place to start.
I would say you modeled for us here tonight that sort of educative approach, right? In which you're trying to get to first principles, you're trying to lay bare what's really behind this position, and then sometimes positions that are not examined can flourish in a way that positions that get examined can't really hold up to scrutiny. And so I think you're inviting, you're encouraging people to do what you did tonight for us, so which I really appreciate.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ruth Ann Church. I need some more help understanding how white Christian nationalism is different than right-wing extremism. And, when I'm hearing about events, what can I do to try to decipher when it's white Christian nationalism and when it's right-wing extremism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I would say that in our contemporary sort of political moment, right, white Christian nationalism is like the, in a lot of ways, I think this is the religiously flavored deep story that's fueling a lot of right-wing extremism. So it's certainly not the, that would be my interpretation. So, and I think, people, again, a lot of these things have different definitions. So like when you say, and overlap. So when you say right-wing extremism, are you talking about like behaviors or I guess sort of?
In my head, a classic example right now is the riots in Britain.
Sure.
They're labeled as right-wing extremist riots.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But a lot of what you talked about tonight has some overlap to those themes.
So just because we don't have the mic, the example of right-wing extremism that you brought up that you would like an exploration of the relationship to white Christian nationalism are the riots in Britain, the sort of anti-immigration, anti-immigrant riots in Britain. Okay.
Yeah, so I think I would say right-wing extremism is a political sort of ideology, right? The political right, that's the right in right-wing. And I think the sort of cultural frameworks, right, or the deep stories that are fueling that could come from a number of sort of different places. It's not necessarily the white Christian United States version that I laid out for you tonight. In the UK, it's probably a variant of that's sort of focused, right, like UK nationalism, if it is religiously flavored at all. It could also be something that is sort of explicitly racial, right? Like this, our country is for a certain racial group, and people that come here that are not that racial group don't belong. Like that's another deep story that's not really religious. That's sort of more of an explicitly like ethnic deep story. But I think white Christian nationalism in the US context is kind of it's the religiously flavored framework, and I think in some ways the justification for a lot of right-wing extremist positions, right? In the same way that it's not necessarily acceptable to say things in sort of public that are openly antagonistic towards a particular racial group. Some people do, but in general, right, that is sort of considered socially deviant. But I think white Christian nationalism allows people a way to express grievances and to talk about that kind of thing in non-explicitly racial terms. So I think it both fuels right-wing extremism and also sort of offers it cover in a way that is politically important. I don't know if that. Okay.
Great. Sure. How about Tom in the back and then Tom in the middle?
Which Tom?
The other Tom, and then you.
Tom the historian. Just a footnote to what has been discussed here in questions. 99 years ago in Dayton, Tennessee, there was the Scopes trial. So that was in the mid-1920s. Also, during that decade, you had the end of World War I, the war to end all wars. You had women getting the right to vote, primarily white women. You had prohibition. You had 50,000 KKK members marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. there was a lot of cultural change mix that was going on that people couldn't understand, and it was way above what they thought was America. There's your history point.
Thank you. Tom Davis, then.
Of course, we had the Democratic National Convention this past week, and of course you looked at maps. You had a blue area and you had a red area. If I were to do a correlation coefficient analysis of white Christian nationalism, I think they would be focused on the red states. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a strong,
Also, with the immigration of Latinos in this country, I think the face of white nationalism will be largely impacted. My daughter lives in Dallas, Texas. I could feel it, of white nationalism. And I wanted to go to a church. And I went to a church there a couple months ago, and I felt that white nationalism was paramount in their behavior and in the service that they were doing. So, being a statistician and working with statistical analysis, I have had inroads as far as how I feel about what's happening. And fortunately for me and several of us in this church, we went through Jim Wallace's book, Fake White Nationalism. And I recommend that anybody who's interested in going through this book, we're starting next month. And that will give you an opportunity to really get into a deep study.
So I'm going to pose a follow-up question based on what he said. Have any scholars, researchers tracked changing attitudes based on Latin American immigration to the U.S.? So much of our rhetoric about, in the current election too, about the crisis at the border and so on, the face of that is the Mexican border, and the face of it is often Latinx. And yet, I think something like 80 or 90% of Latinx immigrants are Catholics, right? And then a large percentage of others are Protestant and especially Pentecostal. So they're Christians, right? And so how does that fit into the narrative? And have people studied this?
Yes. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. So I guess the first thing I would say is that, that is I think kind of a contradiction if you think of, if you're thinking of this idea of a Christian nation as purely religious, right? So you might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you be anti-immigration if you're a Christian nationalist when so many of the immigrants that are coming in are themselves Christian? But again, the Christian of Christian nationalism, right, encompasses so much more than just religion. In some ways, I think race and ethnicity takes sort of priority, right, in that definition. So I'll say that first. But I would also add that a lot of the studies that I was talking about, some of them were sort of in the general population, but many of them were focused on white Americans, right, and looking at how this ideology and cultural framework works for white people. There's ongoing work looking at how these ideas might operate in different sort of racial contexts. So for example, there are a lot of, Latinx Catholics, right, that might score high on measures of Christian nationalism, but their deep story, right, and like their version of what it means to be a Christian nation might look very different and might encapsulate other things. I have a recent paper with Sam Perry, that looks at how these ideas operate differently for white Christians and black Christians, right? Like in the black church, the idea of a Christian nation in general is associated with very different things. So I would say, it's complicated, right? And this is still, I think, an ongoing area of research, how these ideas operate in different racial contexts. And we find, right, so for example, the paper that I have that looks at this is looking at attitudes about gun control, and we find that for white Americans, right, Christian nationalism is pretty strongly associated with opposition to gun control. But for black Americans, it actually works in exactly the opposite way, right? And we argue that this is because ideas of Christian nationhood in the black church are predominantly around sort of values of like community protection and very different sort of, there's different cultural baggage, right, than in this deep story of white Christian nationalism. So, yeah, does that help?
Complex intersectionality.
It's
it
complex.
sounds like.
Yes.
Great. We have a question up front here. Bill, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you. I heard an awful lot of conversation taking from social science into political science, and always, every time with political science, it's leaking to the extreme right. And political scientists will say that the spectrum is not a straight line, it is a circle. So when the extremism, whether it's right or left, just like the Nazism connected with opposite of fascism, so would the extreme right connect with the left. Is it fair to say that extremism on either side contributes to this white Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have also heard that argument that the sort of ideological spectrum is more a circle than a line. So I am not a political scientist, so I'm not sure that I can speak to the sort of validity of that model. And again, I don't have expertise in like areas outside the US, and so this could look very different in different contexts. But I will say that in the context of the contemporary United States, if you score high on Christian nationalism, it's very likely that you also score high on political conservatism. Like those things are pretty closely joined in the US. I think, and this is a point, right, so in sociology, right, like we have conferences about this kind of thing, and this is a point that sociologists are raising, is like we need to be thinking about, we need to be careful about how we frame this, right, because you run the risk, I think, sometimes of when you have a thing that you're focused on, right, so in this case, white Christian nationalism, if you get too sort of myopically focused on that, you can, perhaps miss things that are important, that are sort of happening somewhere else, right? So yeah, like far left extremism, I don't, in my experience of the data and the literature, that I don't think is very correlated with white Christian nationalism, but there might be, right, and this is, some sociologists have argued this, if we spend too much time focusing on this thing, are we missing important things that are happening over here?
So I have a thought about that, which is Latin American liberation theology is a left-leaning set of theological Christian movements that closely align themselves with communist regimes in Latin America in opposition to some of the dictatorships that were seen as oppressive and closely aligned with the dominant Catholic churches. And so they were left-leaning. I don't know about the racial part. I don't think it was correlated so much with a particular racial identity in that situation, but certainly it was similar with respect to taking Christianity to be closely allied with a particular political identity. But that's not in the US context, so as you said, it's happening elsewhere. But yeah, thank you. Edie?
I am finding myself thinking about your description of this framework as a deep story. And so that makes me wonder, like, how is that story transmitted? Right? What are the important ways, and I think I'm naive about this, right? But do we know, like, to what extent how are people, how is this being transmitted? How is this being, spread, and where do people pick it up? Is it at church? Is it, I don't know. I'm very curious about it.
Yeah, that's a that's a fantastic question, and I would say we know less about this than we would like to, simply because it's very hard to gather data on like a transmission process, right? So like I can survey a population and take sort of a snapshot in time of like, what do these people believe right now, right? Like that's something that sociologists do all the time. But it's very hard to look at changes over time in the same population. Like you can kind of do it with cohort studies, right? Where you sort of repeatedly sample the same group and you might ask them the same questions. Because this focus on Christian nationalism in the sociological literature, there's been a sort of, recently I think Taking America Back for God is kind of viewed as kind of the, in some ways the book that kind of got a lot of people interested in this. We don't have a lot of good sort of cohort data on these processes. And I think, I'm hoping that as sort of, this focus in social science and the social scientific literature continues, I'm hoping that we can collect data like that. We could look sort of, if someone is increasing in agreement with a certain sort of deep story, or maybe decreasing in agreement, what are the things that are happening in their life that are correlated with those changes? And like there are ways to deal with that statistically as well. So I think there are ways to look at that, but I think because we don't have the data, anything I could say about this would be sort of speculation. I think parental influence is probably pretty important, right? So I think people are hearing maybe their parents and their peers and their friends talk about this. Some of it very well could be sort of in church communities. But the thing to remember there is that this is sort of everywhere, right? It's not a thing that just happens at church. So like you can get on Amazon and buy a Make America Godly Again t-shirt, right? And like, so I think it absolutely could be sort of transmitted from the pulpit, but certainly not just that. I think it's sort of in the air in a way that's important to realize.
I think of your earlier comment about the battles over public school curricula,
Sure.
right? Because this is a story, and there are stories told in textbooks about American history, right? So that's one battleground for this transmission of these ideas and that story. In the back row there, yes, and he's coming to you with a microphone.
Chris, I guess on a little more of a personal level, I'm curious how you decided to focus on this topic.
Sure.
And do you feel that you have the support of your institution for such a topic in these sort of politically charged times?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say my sort of personal journey to this. I should probably start with this as sort of a disclaimer. I'm a criminologist by training, so a social scientist that. My grad program was sort of half sociology, half criminology, and I was sort of on the crim side. So a lot of my sort of formal training is in crime, and I've long been interested in religion as a sort of complement to that, right? Looking at ways that religion might influence offending, and but I think it was around the time of the Capitol riots, right, where I was like looking at all this religious imagery in the crowd and thinking like, wow, a lot of my work so far has been looking at religion as a buffer, right, and often it is in sort of reducing offending in some capacity, but I was really interested in like what's the flip side of that, like what's going on with all these crosses and and violence and what's happening here. I've also been interested in perceptions of crime, right? Attitudes about the criminal legal system, like how punitive we should be, sort of what is driving gun ownership in the American population, and all of these questions that I'm interested in that are sort of not directly like focused on crime necessarily, but things that are very much in the criminological literature. A lot of these questions I found were leading me back to this idea of white Christian nationalism, right? So that was kind of my own personal journey to this. And I think, it feels like a really important conversation to be having. So I like that I can have, talk in context like this about it, right? It feels like a thing that's very salient to our country at this particular moment. And I think that has encouraged me as well to sort of be focused on this as a research topic. With regard to the institutional question, I'm just starting my second year, so I do feel like I'm getting good support. I do feel like I have a lot of freedom to sort of pursue the things that I feel like are important to me and to the field of sociology broadly. But you're right that it absolutely is. This is a highly sort of politicized topic, right? So I think that that is an important thing to keep in mind. And I would encourage, when you have those, if you end up talking to people about this, be prepared for some pushback maybe, right? Like this is this is a thing that it could make people feel uncomfortable, but I think that's good. I think it's important to feel uncomfortable because that's how we learn. So.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. So how about, go ahead, Laura, and then two more. We'll do two more. We'll do Laura, and then we'll go to you. So let's start with her, and then you'll be next.
Go to David. So the question about the difference between right-wing extremism and white Christian nationalism inspired this question, because how much do we really know about the extent to which, the measures of white Christian nationalist attitudes are around, we should be a Christian nation, religion and school, whatever those items were. To what extent do they really believe that God is on their side? And is that something that helps to differentiate? And then it's like the ends justify the means. I'm thinking about your term of spiritual warfare that you had in one of your slides. This is really like deeply seated attitudes and behaviors. And I'm wondering, how much do we know about that dynamic of kind of weaponizing God? God is on my side. This is a spiritual war, and I'm ready to do what it takes.
Yeah. So I think that is an important thing to recognize, right? That sort of, I think ends justify the means is a great way to describe that. Like, if you believe that you are acting in accordance with a divine mandate to sort of make the United States look a certain way, that's going to potentially, in criminology, we have a term called techniques of neutralization, right? Like ways that people kind of step outside maybe sort of ordinary social norms, and that could potentially serve as a way of sort of neutralizing some of those things that would normally prevent you from maybe engaging in violence, for example. I think it's difficult to say the extent to which, or what this deep story looks like for different people, right? So I think that, and it's difficult, right, on a survey to get at this. So I'm hoping that as this is sort of taking off in the sociological literature, I think qualitative work is a great way to kind of get at that, right? So sort of close, detailed, in-depth interviews with people that are very much sort of in this way of looking at the world, I think could be really useful. But at the moment, I think it's very possible that on a survey, two people could score identically on this measure, and their experience of it could be very different, right? So, for example, one person might be very much thinking of this as yes, I am, this is a mandate direct from God, and it might very much for them be a sort of literal spiritual war, and someone else who could score high and they could be thinking well, I'm really, I'm in it for the political power, right? Or I'm in it because I want to have a, justification for not wanting to live around people that don't look like me, right? So I think this can look different for different people, and it's difficult to say, given the data that we have available.
Great. Last question. Okay, and microphone's coming to you.
It seems to me we've been dealing very importantly with the issues, the problems, and describing the nature of it. I'm riding on the high of this past week Democratic convention, and it just seems to me like I'm hearing some answers of some of the problems that I've been dealing or seeing, and I don't know whether I don't know what my real comment is, other than that I'm just feeling on a high.
So how does this issue play out in the very recent political past, and how are we going to see it in this election cycle?
Yeah, well, I mean, so again, I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I did illustrate sort of ways that this deep story is used politically. So I think this is very present in kind of the kinds of political rhetoric. I will say, particularly on the political right, this is where I think this story is leveraged and has some political purchase. So yeah, I mean, I guess I do feel, and this I guess connects back to sort of my personal experience of about to have a baby and sort of hoping that the version of society that they get to grow up in is what I want it to be. I do think that we as a country are kind of at a bit of an inflection point, right? And I think the extent to which this deep story becomes sort of realized in some ways or not is, I think will be very much affected by what happens in November, would be my view on this. Yeah, does that?
That's great. I have one announcement before we conclude. This church is sponsoring a book study of The False White Gospel by Jim Wallace. There are some flyers available for you to pick up if you're interested. And it's 5-week book discussion, Thursdays, starting on the 12th of September and running through October 10. And there'll be 2 times offered, a 2 p.m. time and a 7 p.m. time. So if anyone's interested in reading through and discussing this book together in a group, there are several of those times available, flyers on your way out. Let's give Dr. Seto one last round of applause.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for coming. Have a great night.